If you've ever been just a little bit curious about how to create your own paper, then this video is for you. By using the materials you probably already have in your own home, we're going to go step by step to create your own paper. So let's turn this into this by collecting some old paper from around the house. But in my case, I work as a librarian and sometimes we have to get rid of old books that are broken or missing pages, and I thought, well, instead of throwing it out or recycling it, why don't we do something with it? So that's exactly what I did. I got this old book that was already missing several pages and chapters, and I started to tear it up into little strips of paper. Now I had my kids help with this part as well, but you're actually going to want to get quite a bit of paper strips. And once you've torn up enough paper, you're going to want to get a big tub and start to fill that up with water. And we're going to let all of the paper strips soak for about an hour or two. Now once everything's good and soaked, you're going to want to get your blender. And then you're going to get handfuls of that soaked paper and add a little bit in. Now as you're adding the paper in, you're also going to want to add some water. Now make sure you put your lid on, and we're going to turn that blender on and just start to pulse it. Now your watery paper will soon start to dissolve into a pulp. You shouldn't see any really big chunks of paper, but it should be a little bit chunky. And now that we have our pulp, we're going to need to get some cotton cloth ready. Now we have this old bed sheet that no one uses, so I'm going to lay this out and start to cut it into squares. And this is going to be the cotton cloth that all of my paper pulp is going to dry on. Now once I have the cloth already, I'm going to prepare another big Tupperware tub thing, and I'm going to fill it with just a few inches of water. Once I have about 3 or 4 inches of water, I'm going to add some of my pulp into the mix and start to swirl it around. Now here's where we'll start making our paper. You're going to need some sort of fine mesh, and the proper tool is called a mold and decal, which is easy enough to make, but today we're going to use this super simple splatter screen as our mesh. So you're going to want to stir around all of the pulp in that water so it's not all lying at the bottom, and then you're going to put your mesh into the water and then very gently just start to lift it up and make sure all of that water starts to drain out. And what you should be left with is a somewhat thick-ish layer of pulp, which will then turn into paper once it dries. Now for me, this is the trickiest part of the process, where we're going to flip our mesh over onto that cloth that we had prepared, and we're going to get a sponge and just slowly start to soak up that water. This will decrease the drying time, and it will also make the pulp kind of adhere to the cloth, so it will dry flat. Now I also found it kind of best practice to not actually soak up all of the water. It seemed to be a little bit easier to have the pulp still like a little bit extra wet, and it just kind of came off of the mesh a little bit easier than if I had been really like sponging it down. So once most of that water has been sponged off, you're going to very carefully start lifting up that mesh that you have and slowly releasing the pressed down pulp. Now there are a couple of different drying methods out there, but what I like to do is super simple. I have my laundry drying rack, and I would just pin up each one of these cloths with the 2B paper on it. Now I also wanted to go and experiment with dyeing the paper different colors. Now I had heard coffee works really well for this, but I'm a tea drinker, so I wanted to use tea to dye the paper. So I made a really steeped pot of tea and just poured it in there. And it kind of just turned a mild, almost like vintagey brown color. When I pulled the pulp out, I didn't see too much of a difference, but I did notice a slight difference after it dried. So the next thing I wanted to experiment with was with dried flowers. Now this one had quite a bit of a learning curve actually. But to start this, I had some dried lavender that I collected from my plants last summer, so I wanted to start with this. So what I had done is I just lifted the mesh out of the water and placed it down on a towel, and then I started to put some lavender around. And I actually had some extra dried baby's breath around, so I thought I'd sprinkle that one on too. So once I was happy with the placement, I went and carefully grabbed the mesh and flipped it over and started to sponge off that water. And I found by doing this in this particular order, it was the best because it pressed the flowers down into the pulp and had them actually kind of adhere into the pulp so they wouldn't just like slough off afterwards. And for my third experiment, I wanted to dye the paper again, but I wanted it to be kind of a more vivid color than that natural tea color. Now there's a couple of ways to dye this pulp, but I decided to use the food coloring route because it was kind of the easiest. I've heard people using paint and other things like that, but I think where I went wrong was doing it red. If anyone's been a baker before and you've tried to make a cake red, it's very difficult. It always ends up turning pink. So I feel like if you had a different color like blue or green, it would be a lot more successful. But the red just wasn't the vivid color that I was hoping for. However, it did turn the paper slightly pink, and it was kind of a soft, sweet pink. So it kind of worked out in the end anyways. So I let all of these papers dry for about 15 to 20 hours or so, and then I got to very satisfyingly pull off the paper from the cloth. And once you've collected all of your pieces of dried paper, you are finished and you're left with these beautiful textured pieces of art. Some of the papers ended up being more white, and some of them were this more beautiful vintage color that the tea dyed. And then there was the soft pink papers, which were also beautiful. And then of course we also had all of these beautiful lavender pieces in some of the papers as well. And depending on whatever project you're doing, each type of paper has its own place. Now, I loved doing this project. This was a really fun one, but it was quite a process. Anyone who says making paper is super easy is not being totally truthful, I think. It's not necessarily difficult, but it is a process, and it's not just something that's done in 30 minutes. It is going to take you a while. It's going to take you at least a solid day of kind of start to finish, or maybe even longer depending on your drying process. Now, I hope you've enjoyed watching this process. It was a lot of fun making this paper, and if you've made it to this part of the video, thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. So I hope you make your own paper and you have as much fun as I did. But until next time, happy making, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!